Good day. Today is Tuesday, 29th April 2025, and as I anticipated in my program yesterday, President Zelensky of Ukraine appears to have rejected President Putin's proposal for a ceasefire for the holiday on the 9th of May, 3-day ceasefire around the holiday on the 9th of May, which is the day that Russia and previously the Soviet Union commemorated their victory during the Second World War over Germany. Zelensky has fired back. He said that a ceasefire of that kind really isn't enough. The kind of ceasefire Ukraine wants is a ceasefire for 30 days, that kind of ceasefire, a ceasefire that will save lives, as opposed to a ceasefire that is purely intended to allow parades to take place. Zelensky also did something else, which perhaps is rather more chilling, which is that he actually publicized a meeting which took place between himself and various senior intelligence officials of the Ukrainian intelligence system, in which apparently they reported on the assassination of the Russian general that took place a few days ago in a town near Moscow. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that the Ukrainians have acted so quickly in acknowledging their own involvement in an assassination on Russian territory. And Zelensky, through this act, appears to be taking direct responsibility for this assassination. He's not making it appear as if it was just the work of Budanov or of officials of the SBU or anything of that kind. He is in effect admitting his own direct role in ordering the assassination of senior Russian officials. The Russians, by the way, have made no response so far to this admission from Ukraine. But anyway, there it is. The admission has now been made. Now, all of this is completely unsurprising. I said in my program yesterday that to my certain knowledge, the Russian military, or at least the senior personnel of the Russian military, people of the general staff and senior commanders, have never been happy with these regular announcements by President Putin of ceasefires. I can remember one further instance, when Putin announced a ceasefire, a one-day ceasefire, on the second day of the special military operation itself, back in February 2022. Now, this was at a time when the Russian army was supposed to be moving as rapidly as it could to occupy as much territory as it could in order to increase the pressure on the government in Kiev. Anyway, that rapid movement was interrupted for a whole day, a crucial day, by President Putin's sudden and unilateral announcement of a ceasefire made following an apparent agreement by President Zelensky at that time to begin negotiations. And I can remember again that the Russian military at that time made little secret of their own exasperation at this decision. So I expect that this time, even as Zelensky rejects the May 9th ceasefire, there will be significant pressure from the Russian military on Putin to accept that the ceasefire, that particular ceasefire, is simply not going to happen. Incidentally, and in parting, whereas it seems there was some pressure from the West on Zelensky to agree to Putin's proposal for an Easter ceasefire about a week ago, there is no analogous pressure this time from the West to get him to agree to the ceasefire, the proposed ceasefire, around the 9th of May. And as I said, I suspect that the senior people in the Russian army will be somewhat relieved about this. Anyway, there we are. That is the state of the situation between Putin and Zelensky as of the time of making this program. Now, Russian officials have been very busy making comments over the last 24 hours. Medvedev and Patrushev especially, though Peskov has also had some interesting things to say, and I will come to all of those in a moment. But it's worth perhaps recapping where we are exactly at this particular time. Firstly, it seems clear to me that all of the time and energy that Donald Trump and his officials have devoted since February, the end of February, to try to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to agree to a temporary ceasefire of at least 30 days, which would then become a permanent ceasefire, that all of those attempts to try to get a ceasefire agreed before talks between the Russians, the Ukrainians, perhaps the Americans, on a substantive settlement. All of those attempts have now basically come to nothing. The Russians have made it quite clear that they're not prepared to agree to a temporary ceasefire, as they said all along. The Russians also have made it very clear that if such a ceasefire does ever take place, it must be accompanied with promises for the complete cessation of all Western military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. And that, of course, is something the Ukrainians won't agree to, and the Western powers won't agree to either. So around 3 months of time has been wasted on this wild goose chase of trying to get a ceasefire agreed between Russia and Ukraine. And it looks as if the Americans have finally abandoned it. Now, last week, the Americans and the Europeans each put forward rival framework proposals about how the conflict in Ukraine might end. They did so, apparently, without entering into detailed discussions with the Russians. Witkoff has been traveling to Moscow. He's been hearing what the Russians have to say. He's been reporting on all of this to Donald Trump, but it's quite clear that only a certain amount of it has entered into the American process of decision making, so that the American proposal that was presented to the Ukrainians and the Europeans on Tuesday and Wednesday was still, in its essentials, General Kellogg's old proposal of April 2024. In fact, we had a report about 2 weeks ago in Bloomberg that there'd been a discussion before Trump in which Witkoff and Kellogg had basically argued in front of Trump. Witkoff had suggested that as the Russians demand, the entirety of the 4 regions be transferred to Russia to bring the war to a quick conclusion, and Kellogg, consistently more sympathetic to the Ukrainians, pushed back and said that the Ukrainians would never agree to a proposal of that kind. So the Americans put forward a proposal which, as I said, does at least acknowledge certain Russian concerns, but which is largely based on Kellogg's April 2024 plan. The Europeans put forward their own proposal, which, whilst taking Donald Trump's ideas for a ceasefire, clearly is intended to lead to the achievement of President Zelensky's so-called peace plan, which requires the Russians to pull out completely from every millimeter of Ukrainian territory, or rather the territory that Ukraine possessed on the 1st of January 2014, to pay reparations, to have the Europeans maintain indefinite sanctions against Russia, all sorts of things that I discussed at length in a program that I made some days ago. A truly astonishing proposal. Now, all of these ideas, all of these plans and proposals were, as I said, negotiated or agreed by the Western powers with each other. Exactly what Eve Smith wrote about years ago and what George Beebe discussed in a program that he did with Glenn Deason and myself. The Europeans, the Americans, spending a vast amount of time discussing with each other what the way forward should be without consulting or getting or listening to the opinions of the other side. And in each case, coming forward with proposals which are simply unworkable. Certainly the European proposal is unworkable. It's one that the Russians would be bound to reject in its entirety. But the American proposal, though an advance on the European proposal, is also a proposal that falls far short of what the Russians are seeking, and which the Russians might take as a point of discussion, but which they are not going to accept in the form in which it was presented to them. And again, I have to say that this is classic West pattern of Western negotiations, if you like to say, but it makes absolutely no sense. It means that all of this time, energy, all of these last couple of weeks have been spent discussing proposals which are fundamentally and essentially unworkable. Now, this simply does not take into account the realities. The reality at the moment is that the Russians are advancing in Ukraine. They're advancing perhaps more slowly than some people would like. They are advancing faster than some people perhaps realize. But the key thing is that they are advancing. And there is no force that the West is going to be able to bring to bear short of World War III that is going to stop them advancing further or advancing as far as they wish to go. So, if peace is to be achieved, the logical, the obvious way, and I speak, by the way, through long experience as a former negotiator, obviously not at this level and in the context of wars, but in terms of, if you like, legal conflicts. Anyway, the obvious thing to do, if one wants to stop the Russians from advancing further westwards, which I presume is the object of the exercise, is to go to the Russians and ask them, what is it that you want from us which would persuade you to stop? That, I would have thought, is the starting point for any negotiation. Now, of course, if asked that question, the Russians will probably demand a great deal. Perhaps more than the Western powers, and certainly the Ukrainians, would be willing to concede. But if one approaches a negotiation in that way, yes, maybe you can push back. You can say, well, look, this goes too far. We can't concede this now. But at least you are at that point negotiating from a realistic position. What the Western powers have been trying to do instead is that they've been trying to present the Russians with what might be described as fait accompli, worked out settlement plans, which the Russians are expected to accept, and which show no regard for the fact that it is their army which is advancing and which will continue to do so, and which reflects Western concerns. Now, that is not a way to conduct negotiations. Again, I repeat, I am somebody with a background who has had an extensive background in conducting negotiations, and I have also been a mediator on occasion myself. So, what to do? Well, it seems to me that finally, probably on Saturday, when Witkoff met with Putin, we finally reached that point when it became clear, especially to the United States, that the Russians are not going to accept these plans. The American plan is couched as a take it or leave it plan. The Russians, if asked, would probably in that case say, well, if it's a take it or leave it plan, thank you very much. We will leave it. We're certainly not going to take it. We're not going to be intimidated into saying that we won't leave it when it is clearly in our interests that that is what we should do. Anyway, what basically happened on Saturday is that was what it looks as if Putin and Ushakov and the others explained to Witkoff. They're not prepared to work with this plan. They might take some of the points in it further into negotiations. They could see that progress is being made. They're not prepared to accept a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians won't honour, and which will be used, certainly by the European states, to strengthen Ukraine. But that doesn't mean they're not prepared to talk, and that this is the moment now to start negotiations, and serious negotiations, which first and foremost should be negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And I think this is a moment of understanding that the Americans actually reached. And we've had a number of statements today from top US officials. So J.D. Vance, by far the most realistic American politician about this entire conflict, basically from a very early point in it, by the way, he's clearly done extensive research. He seems by far the best informed about the conflict and the one who's understood the military realities best of all. Anyway, he has said that he's made comments to the effect that Ukraine is clearly losing the war, that it is an absolute fallacy. It is an absurd idea to think that the war can somehow be won against the Russians. It is an absurd idea to think that Russia is simply going to collapse at some point in the near future. These are my words, they are not his, but I am relaying the substance of what he said. What he said was that if the war continues in the way that it is going at the moment, then the Russians will continue winning the war and the Ukrainians will continue to lose the war. And with every step that the Russians advance, the Ukrainian position in any negotiations will become weaker and weaker until the point comes eventually when there is nothing left to negotiate about because the Russians will have won. Now, again, I'm summarizing J.D. Vance's words, and I might to some extent be adding ideas to his words, which it seems to me are consistent with them in terms of what he said. But anyway, once again, J.D. Vance said it as it is. And I hope and believe, by the way, that this is being now listened to properly by the president himself. Anyway, President Trump has also been speaking, and he says that he's doing everything he can to prevent Ukraine from being crushed. He's spoken about the mighty war machine that Ukraine is up against. Absolutely correct. And he's clearly indicating once more that it is overwhelmingly in Ukraine's interests, therefore, to seek peace. And my own view, in fact, I'm clear that this is what actually happened, is that to the extent that they discussed anything meaningful over the course of that 15-minute conversation in St. Peter's Basilica, the conversation that took place then between Trump and Zelensky was a demand from Trump to Zelensky to enter into negotiations with Putin, with the Russians, in the way that the Russians have demanded. Now, it doesn't seem as if Zelensky agreed, and several days have passed, and there's no sign yet that Zelensky, in fact, has agreed. He's not made any step towards beginning direct negotiations with the Russians. Now, perhaps in light of that, an article has now appeared in the Financial Times which says that Europe fears Trump prepared to walk away from Ukraine talks. And then we're told, somewhat strangely, that officials, and that obviously means European officials, are worried US President will use minor progress in talks as excuse to disengage. And then we go on to read, European and Ukrainian officials fear Donald Trump is on the brink of walking away from peace negotiations with Kiev and Moscow, potentially using minor progress in talks as an excuse to say his job is done, according to people briefed on the discussions. The US president was elected on a promise to end the war in 24 hours, but his overtures to Russia's President Putin and attempts to strong-arm the Ukrainian leadership have failed to win backing for his initial proposal of a 30-day ceasefire, let alone a lasting truce. Following talks with the United States in recent days, European and Ukrainian officials are convinced Trump is ready to seize any kind of breakthrough this week, which marks his first 100 days in office, even if it falls short of a long-term solution, four officials told the Financial Times. Now, again, we're not told who these officials are, and all of this is anonymous, but note that we are told that these are actually officials. These are not people well informed about the matter who might be journalists, academics, people taken off the street and who read the newspapers or anything like that. These are actual officials. They are officials of European governments. And then we go on to read, one European official said Trump was setting up a situation where he gives himself excuses to walk away and leaves it to Ukraine and us, which is to say Europe, to fix. Putin's unwillingness to agree to key US and Ukrainian demands, such as maintaining a post-war Ukrainian military force. Why anybody thought he would agree to that, I have absolutely no idea. But anyway, and the complexity of the conflict has made Trump reevaluate his commitment to a peace deal, they added. Now, I think all of this is essentially true. We then go on to read that US officials, and I wonder whether this isn't, again, US officials isn't a euphemism for General Kellogg. We then go on to read US officials were getting concerned that they're really coming back with nothing in talks with Russia. and began floating ideas for a deal that could fit into Trump's quick timeline, a person briefed on the discussions said. But Trump's push for a quick end to the war has run against Putin's intransigence to agree to terms that fall short of his maximalist demands, such as denazifying Ukraine. There are people who think the Russians might go along with Trump's proposal, the person added. Nothing in place but there is nothing in place to actually make this work. Some of the elements are actually good, but it's the impatience of doing it now that's the problem. Well, let's take a step back and think about this. We're told that officials, that of course means Witkoff, have been going to Moscow with all sorts of proposals, which are of course Kellogg's proposals, and to Trump's frustration and perhaps surprise, and maybe Kellogg's also, Witkoff has been coming back from Moscow and is saying, look, Putin is not accepting any of this. He's not prepared to go with Kellogg's proposal. He set out his position way back in June 2024, which is Istanbul Plus, and, well, he's not prepared to move from that. And, well, this seems to have caused surprise and dismay. We read US officials were getting concerned that they're really coming back with nothing in talks with Russia. And anyway, it looks as if Trump is becoming disillusioned that the Russians will ever agree to Kellogg, be it Kellogg Plus or Kellogg Minus, at least in any kind of time span that seems to work for his political interests. And I think he's getting equally frustrated with Zelensky himself, because Putin says, look, why don't we and the Ukrainians just sit down and end this thing? And we were told by Resident, the Ukrainian Telegram channel, that during the brief encounter in Rome, Trump also told Zelensky to get down and start talking to the Russians. But as might have been predicted, Zelensky showing no enthusiasm or interest or desire to do so. The Russians today have again repeated that they are prepared to enter into negotiations. Peskov was asked about the question of Zelensky's illegitimacy, as far as the Russians are concerned, and Peskov responded as follows. President Putin has repeatedly stated Moscow's readiness to start peace talks with Ukraine without preconditions, but there has still been no response from Kiev. We haven't heard a response from the Kiev regime to this point. As for President Macron's statement about the need to increase pressure from Russia, well, that Macron always makes these kind of statements. Peskov went on to say that one gets the impression that France completely ignores President Putin's statements, which is unfortunate. On the question of Zelensky's illegitimacy, it poses problems to the peace process, but achieving a peace settlement is the top priority. The most important thing now is to launch this process. Everything else is secondary. This is not inconsistent with what the Russians have said many times. Putin's point has been that obviously he will negotiate with Zelensky if he must, because there is no one else in power in Kiev at the moment. So you can't choose your negotiating partner. That doesn't mean that Putin considers Zelensky to be legitimate. But the problem is, if an agreement is reached, will Zelensky have the authority, the constitutional authority, to sign the agreement? And if he doesn't, and the agreement isn't worth the paper it is written on, what happens then? But officially, publicly, the Russian position has always been that they're prepared to enter into negotiations. They've been saying this since the collapse of the Istanbul talks in April 2022. They said this to the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians last year. They say it still, but obviously the issue of Zelensky's legitimacy remains an issue, but not an issue that prevents talks. So Peskov, anyway, again confirmed that the Russians are willing and ready to enter into negotiations. But as I said previously, it doesn't look as if Zelensky is. He's still talking about a ceasefire. He wants to have a 30-day ceasefire. He's still committed to the European proposal, the proposal that was presented in a position paper back at the meeting in London, the one that Reuters published, the one I discussed in my program of 3 days ago. He's not prepared to move from that position either. So Trump now finds himself at a point of stop. Now, there continue to be people who advocate further sanctions. There was an article today in the Daily Telegraph by Owen Matthews, a commentator who has been strongly supportive of Ukraine, but who has also acknowledged some of the realities in the conflict. And overall, I would say somebody who is one of the more level-headed people, who writes for the Daily Telegraph and also, by the way, for the Spectator magazine. But anyway, he again spoke about further sanctions on Russia, and he spoke about imposing sanctions on secondary sanctions intended to stop all Russian energy exports, to try to deter countries around the world from buying Russian oil and gas. Presumably, that would extend to taking steps to seize Russian ships or ships from other countries carrying Russian gas on the high seas, in effect trying to impose that kind of economic blockade on Russia. I'm not sure whether these people quite understand the immensity of what they're calling for. I mean, this would amount, actually, if we're talking about putting an economic blockade on a country and seizing its ships and ships that trade with it on the high seas. I mean, that is, as far as I'm concerned, in fact, I have no doubt about this, legally speaking, a clear act of war. Just saying. I mean, it would be as much of an act of war as launching missiles onto the territory of another country. Just saying. Though arguably on an even bigger scale. But let's just take a step back and assume it worked. Russia is today the world's third largest producer of oil. It is the world's biggest producer of natural gas. It is, I believe, one of the biggest producers, if not the biggest producer, of uranium ore. It is absolutely crucial. It plays a critical role in the entire balance of economic trade and in the stability of the global energy system. Now, I cannot imagine, I think it is inconceivable that a plan of this kind would be workable. I've already said that China, for one, would undoubtedly reject it. China is already the target of massive tariffs, which have essentially stopped all trade between China and the United States. China, of course, has imposed retaliatory tariffs on the United States of its own. The Chinese would not, therefore, be additionally affected in any significant way if they imported oil from Russia. If the United States and the Europeans, however, decided that they would apply secondary tariffs against China for importing Russian oil, well, not just the United States, but the European Union would be blocked from access to Chinese goods, and the inflationary implications of that are awesome. Moreover, if it was all done through legislation, it might be difficult to walk back, and we would be locked into an economic crisis. But going beyond that, let's assume that for reasons I cannot imagine, the Chinese and others decided that they would abide by these sanctions. Let's assume that Russian energy exports did indeed stop completely. I've already discussed in programs that Alex Christoforou and I did some months ago that even that would not be the killing blow to the Russian economy that many people in the West imagine. Certainly it would cause problems, but it would not mean that the Russian government would run out of money. It would not mean that the Russian industrial system would grind to a stop. It would not mean that Russia would not be able to go on producing tanks and armored vehicles and shells and all of those kind of things. But it would provoke a massive economic crisis in the West. It would mean that the biggest global producer of energy was no longer exporting energy at a time when the amount of gas in gas storage reserves in Europe and in Ukraine is at critically low levels. Yes, oil prices have been sliding over the last few weeks on fears of recession. But you take out one of the world's biggest suppliers entirely at the same time as you're trying to take out Iran's oil supplies and Venezuela's as well. It's difficult to see how energy prices would not start to rise again. And I'm not going to try and guess to what figure, but I'm guessing it would be at least $100 a barrel, probably much, much more. I'm just guessing. I'm not going to try and work it out or grind it out. At a time when Europe is already in stagflation and the United States probably is, well, is this a wise move? Is this not going to make the economic situation for people around the world, which is already hard, much, much worse without achieving the objective that these people suppose? So anyway, just coming back to this issue, if the United States, if President Trump have now come up against the immovable obstacle, which is Vladimir Zelensky, who won't negotiate with the Russians, and if the Russians are refusing a ceasefire, then surely this is the right moment for the United States to pull out. To pull out, to say that it's done everything that it possibly can, that it cannot negotiate or move the process of negotiation forward any further, that the Russians and the Ukrainians are always at liberty to talk to each other anyway. They don't need the United States to do that. And if the Europeans want to go on helping the Ukrainians to win an unwinnable war, well, that is their business. It is not the business of the United States. Now, that seems to me, at this point in time, perhaps the logical position for the United States to make. I've been advocating for it all along for weeks now. Now, that then brings us as to what might happen next. As we will see shortly, the Russians are now banging on the gates of Konstantinovka and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. It seems to me that there is a good chance that by the autumn, the battle for Donbass will be either ended or within sight of being ended, with a likely fall of all of these cities. I have a belief, I'm going to say that it's actually a lot more than a belief, that when that happens, when the entire territory of Donbass is liberated, Putin is likely to make his own proposal, which is that there will be a ceasefire. There can be a ceasefire if the Ukrainians withdraw from Zaporozhye city and the remainder of Zaporozhye city and from the remainder of Kherson region, including Kherson city. There can then be a ceasefire, and in return for the withdrawal from those places, the Russians might be prepared to allow Ukraine to recover some territory that the Russians now control in Kharkiv and Sumy region as a result of recent battles. Now, I think such a Russian proposal cannot be discounted. I remember that there were rumors in the summer of 2022, directly after the fall of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, that Putin was mulling that kind of proposal and that he'd informed the Saudis that he was intending to make it. So it would not surprise me if he put forward that proposal again. But if that proposal is rejected, then important consequences will follow. Now, just to say, that may be the moment, if Donald Trump really wants to play a role in brokering a peace, when it might be the moment for him to step in and to try to get the Ukrainians to understand, finally, that the game is indeed up and that they have to settle, essentially, on Russian terms. Not just the Ukrainians, but the Europeans also. Anyway, that's for the weeks going forward. And maybe, as I said, not going to happen before the late summer, early autumn, at the earliest. But I said that if such a Russian proposal is made and it is not accepted, consequences will follow. Well, a number of Russian officials have now spoken, and they've given clear indications, the clearest indications of what those consequences will be. The first is Patrushev, who is, of course, Putin's former national security advisor, Putin's very close friend, by all accounts, a senior member of the Security Council of Russia, of which he was previously secretary, and who is now in overall charge of Russia's shipbuilding industry, including the program to develop Russia's navy, concerning which he recently held a conference which was attended by Putin himself. Anyway, Patrushev spoke to TASS and has now given an important interview. He said this: Our country respects the will of the people. This was demonstrated during the accession of Crimea, Sevastopol, Donbass, and Novorossiya. And this comment was made when Patrushev was asked by TASS whether Russia was laying claim on any Ukrainian ports or planning to discuss it during any settlement process. And then he went on to say this: residents of Ukrainian regions, including Black Sea coastal areas, should be given an opportunity to decide on their own future. I don't think they connect their future to neo-Nazism. They don't want to feebly obey the illegitimate Kiev government. I believe that Odessa and the majority of its residents have nothing in common with the Kiev regime. And then he reminded TASS that Odessa was founded by Russian Empress Catherine the Great and remained Russia's stronghold in the Black Sea for more than 2 centuries. So that was Patrushev. And then in what I suspect was a coordinated statement, another Russian official, a member of the Duma, a Mr. Sheremet, actually quite a well-known member of the Duma, if I have to say, he spoke out about it as well. This is Mikhail Sheremet, member of the State Duma, and he said the following: historically, this is also questioned by TASS, historically, the hero city of Odessa has always been a Russian city through and through, and for decades it has been a thorn in the side of the Ukrainian authorities, as in fact Odessa has never had anything in common with Ukraine as a state. Now notice that this is the identical wording used by Patrushev, which strongly suggests that these two statements by Patrushev and Sheremet have been coordinated. Anyway, Sheremet goes on to say, Odessa has never accepted the alien ideology and politics of the Kiev regime. Seeking to intimidate people, they burned dozens of civilians alive, losing Odessa for good. He's talking about a fire that took place in the trade union building in Odessa in May 2022 during the height of the protests against the Maidan seizure of power, coup, as the Russians call it, an event that very few people in the West are aware of, but which no one in the Russian world has forgotten. And then Sheremet goes on to say this crime was a point of no return, with Odessa residents totally rejecting the authorities that are being forced on them. And this is manifested in mass disobedience and the elimination of Ukrainian volunteers working for the Territorial Recruitment Center because Odessa residents are reluctant to fight against the Russian people. So, 2 statements by 2 Russian officials, both appearing on TASS on the same day, talking about Odessa as a Russian city, Odessa not belonging to Ukraine, Odessa having its heart with Russia and being a Russian city through and through. Well, that is not a coincidence. Patrushev freely acknowledges that the status of Odessa will be raised by the Russians over the course of any negotiations they conduct with the Ukrainians. But I cannot help but think that these comments appearing in TASS over the course of today, directly after the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, the meeting in which the Russians said that this can only end through negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, that this is both a warning, these comments are both a warning and a threat, that unless there is a negotiated peace on Russian terms, then the Russians will continue to advance and will move forward, and that Odessa will undoubtedly be a priority for them and will be brought back under Russian control, as they would say, reunited with the motherland. Now, that's Patrushev and Sheremet, who have been speaking and talking about Odessa. I think this is, by the way, entirely serious warning and should be taken extremely seriously by people in the West, in the United States, and in Ukraine itself. Whether it will be, of course, is a completely different matter. One other Russian has been speaking, and that is Medvedev. Medvedev has delivered a speech to a Russian NGO that, as far as I understand it, deals mostly with historical matters. But he's given a lengthy overview of the situation in the war and of where it is going. And he's made a whole series of very interesting points. Firstly, he's spoken about the fact that Russia's victory is a prerequisite for peace in Europe. The completion of the special military operation with Russia's victory is the first step towards lasting peace in Europe and the future new global world order, which will be based on mutual respect and justice, on sustainable development. This is the only way to ensure a bright future, and our partners who represent the majority of people on Earth, the global South, East, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, share this view. Changing the global order will probably require years, if not decades, but we must do this, as otherwise humanity will not be able to survive. So that was one thing that Medvedev said. And then he made very clear, again, that for the Russians, regime change is a priority. We need to win the special military operation and Ukraine, and we also need to destroy the regime in Kiev. I'm talking about the regime because the future of the state will be decided later. When these murderous individuals, he used much stronger language, say something, it's not on behalf of the Ukrainian people. And he emphasized that the need to take every measure to make sure that this regime that a regime like that was never revived in any country, because the price of failing to do so is too high. Now, again, Medvedev has talked about regime change in Kiev before, but he does so directly after Lavrov himself, the Russian foreign minister, spoke about it, as I discussed in my program yesterday. So again, shortly after the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, we have two senior Russian officials, Lavrov and Medvedev, each coming out and saying that regime change in Kiev is essential in order to achieve peace in Ukraine. Now, I saw a report, and I want to stress this is a report, I think it is more a rumor than a report, that the Russians have cooled on the idea of Viktor Medvedchuk as the person best positioned to take over in Kiev when the entire regime there, as they call it, not just Zelensky, but Poroshenko, Klitschko, all of the others, are basically removed from the scene. They've given up on the idea of Medvedchuk being the person to take over. The person they're now thinking about is Nikolai Azarov. I call him Nikolai Azarov. In Ukrainian, his first name is Mykola Azarov. But I believe that Azarov is actually an ethnic Russian. And anyway, he lives in Russia. So I'm going to call him Nikolai Azarov. Now, Azarov is in exile in Russia. He was previously Prime Minister of Ukraine during the time when Viktor Yanukovych was president, though the two parted on bad terms sometime before, shortly before, Yanukovych himself was overthrown. It is widely known that Azarov wanted a much stronger line to be taken against the Maidan protests than Yanukovych did, and that this was what basically caused the conflict between the two men and led to the parting of the way between them. There were other points of disagreement between them also. It was also Azarov, incidentally, who advised strongly against moving forward with the partnership agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. He said that it would destroy Ukrainian industry, about which he was perfectly right, as it happens. And anyway, obviously that made Azarov persona non grata in Brussels and for many people in Ukraine. Anyway, Azarov would be an interesting choice. I don't know how much weight to place on this report, but the suggestion is that he's fairly well known and respected in Ukraine, at least in eastern Ukraine, in a way that maybe Medvedchuk himself is not, and that he's demonstrably a tough individual and an effective technocrat, and that he would be a strong figure to put in charge in Kiev to sort out the problems in Kiev, in Ukraine, whatever Ukraine is left after the special military operation has ended. I'm not sure that this report is true, let me stress again, but it would not surprise me if it is, and it's maybe something to park away in a drawer somewhere and think about once we get closer to the point when those sort of scenarios begin to become real. So there it is. The Russians, they've clearly rejected Kellogg Minus or Kellogg Plus. If Witkoff was sent to Moscow in order to get them to accept it and perhaps to agree a ceasefire, he obviously failed. Putin told him in no uncertain terms, as Russian officials have reiterated over the last several days, Lavrov, as I discussed in my program yesterday, Medvedev, and Patrushev today, essentially, the Russian demands, the terms the Russians insist upon are the same ones that Putin outlined back in June 2024. The Financial Times has now acknowledged this. It speaks of American frustration that Putin isn't prepared to retreat from what is always referred to as his maximalist demands. In other words, the demands that he set out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry of 14th June 2024. We do not hear from the Financial Times anything more than those well-informed people who were well-informed about the matter, about Putin supposedly agreed to Witkoff, that the Russians would agree to stop at the present contact line, leaving large territories of the four regions under Ukrainian control, provided the Americans went ahead and recognized Crimea as Russian. The latest Financial Times article, notice, says nothing about that. That particular article served its purpose when it was published. I said that it was clearly a piece of misdirection. Peskov himself Putin's spokesman all but said as much at the time. It served its purpose. It either failed or succeeded. And anyway, now it can be forgotten. We can admit to the truth that the Russians are holding firm to their positions and are not shifting from them. So, there we go. What is Trump going to do? The Financial Times article could be seen as corroborating, at least to some degree, the comment in Resident about Trump giving Zelensky in Rome a 10-day ultimatum to get talks organized with the Russians and agree a ceasefire, or the United States will walk away. And the latest comments by J.D. Vance and by Trump himself may point in that same direction also. So we were told that this is going to be a critical week. We're not yet halfway through the week, but there is no visible movement at the moment. The Russians are saying that it all depends on Zelensky. Zelensky, as The Economist has now admitted, is now fully entrenched in power in Kiev. I pointed out some weeks ago that the day when he could be easily ousted from power has gone. The opportunity to do that has gone. He's now forged very strong links with the nationalist forces in Ukraine and with the various militias there, and his people control the security agencies. He's also pursued effectively, very effectively, his campaign against his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko. I understand that a court in Kiev has now convicted Poroshenko and sentenced him to 15 years in prison. So if Zelensky doesn't decide on negotiations over the course of the next few days, it's difficult to see anyone else doing so. Now, we're told that the Europeans are concerned that the Americans might be prepared to quit the negotiations. And one can understand why. Because if the Americans quit the negotiations, then logically they're going to stop further military aid to Ukraine. And the Europeans will be left by themselves trying to support Ukraine and Zelensky, by the way, through the rest of the war. Something which everybody knows they are not able to do. So it's understandable that they would be concerned about this threat from the Americans. And we are told that the Europeans were briefly, this is also in the Financial Times article, that the Europeans were briefly encouraged by the fact that Trump has made some criticisms of Putin and of the Russians over the last few weeks, over the last few days, over the missile strikes in Kiev. But the Financial Times article then goes on to acknowledge that despite those criticisms, Trump has shown no sign that he's prepared to walk back on any of the decisions that he has made, such as ruling out Ukraine's membership of NATO and conceding Russian control of Crimea and the territory in the 4 regions that Russia controls, that caused the Ukrainians and the Europeans so much concern. So there's no sign that the Americans are changing their stance, and that then begs the question of what exactly it is that the Europeans are going to do. And the Financial Times says that all of these developments have led some European capitals. Which European capitals? London, probably, Paris, perhaps, Germany, Berlin, to rethink their efforts to keep Trump engaged and instead to do the right thing and not what Trump wants. Kiev has quietly begun preparing to go it alone in anticipation of a US pullout by increasing domestic arms production and intensifying talks with European allies about future assistance. It is utter fantasy. It is an absurd idea. I've already discussed in many places, Brian Beletic has discussed in many places, the reality of Russian military production. I've discussed also in many places the economic crisis that is affecting Europe. Ukraine is heading towards an economic crisis of its own. Its military production is at minimal levels, and so far as I can see, basically is confined now to repairing some armoured vehicles, manufacturing a small number of shells, not many, and trying to produce as many drones as it can. European capitals are in no position to fill the gap, any sort of gap, left by the Americans. The idea of doing the right thing if the Americans pull out, ignoring what Trump wants, not attempting to persuade Trump to change his mind, all of that, and just going ahead and continuing to recognize Ukraine is the most extraordinary folly that could ever have conceived of. But it is to this that European diplomacy and statesmanship appears to have been reduced. Now, there are alternatives. They could have a frank discussion with Zelensky. They could tell him, look, the Americans are pulling out. We don't have the capacity, the means and resources to take their place. We're not able to help you any further. We've done all that we can. Stepping up military production in Europe to the point where it would make a difference to the war is impossible. And a European expeditionary force to Ukraine is a non-starter. Opposition in our countries would be far too strong. And besides, such an expeditionary force, if it were ever sent to Ukraine, would be meat on the plate for the Russian military to gobble up. That would be telling the Ukrainians the truth. That would be confronting Zelensky with the realities. Perhaps Zelensky himself won't listen. Perhaps members of his entourage won't listen. Maybe the Ukrainians at that point will dig in. But at least, finally, it would be telling the Ukrainians the truth. And it might also productively be accompanied, if the Americans have indeed pulled out, with a European initiative to speak to the Russians. Now, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Peter Szijjártó, has been to Moscow on a few occasions. Viktor Orban notoriously visited Moscow last summer and got a huge amount of criticism for doing so. Robert Fico is due to go to Moscow as well in a few days to attend the Victory Day parade there. I'm not sure whether Orban is going. I believe he may be, but I'm not absolutely certain. Vučić of Serbia also is going, ignoring all the threats. Well, maybe going to Moscow during the Victory Parade would be too much for any European representative. But, well, why not send someone to Moscow now? Why not have those contacts with the Russians, which the Americans are not able to carry forward because Trump has lost patience and is walking away? You don't have to row back anything you said about Russia. You don't have to row back anything about you said about Ukraine. You don't have to lift any sanctions. But at least you can begin a dialogue. So if the situation, or rather when the situation in Ukraine becomes impossible, when the Ukrainian army starts to break down, at least you have some line of contact with Moscow, some basis for discussion with Moscow in order to manage the consequences. A few weeks ago, there was discussions about whether or not the European Union should appoint a high representative to represent the European Union in discussions with the Russians. And it led to a row between Sanchez and Kaja Kallas. There was then a decision made that there should be such a European high representative. Macron put himself forward. I don't know whether he was formally appointed to that task. He has done absolutely nothing since. He's made no outreach to the Russians at all. He's certainly not called Putin. He's certainly not had any discussions with the Russians. He's not sent his foreign minister to meet Lavrov. He's done nothing. All that he has done is make further threats against the Russians, which is going to simply annoy the Russians. And besides, as I've said in many programs, he is not someone that the Russians would ever accept anyway as an interlocutor. He is somebody that they lost confidence in and trust in a long time ago. So, do nothing. Crank up your rhetoric in support of Ukraine. Continue to send machines to the extent that you have them. 5 tanks every 3 months or something like that. Whatever shells you can scramble together. Maybe you can give some billions more to President Pavel and he can go out and buy more overpriced and defective shells on the international arms market. Or maybe he can find that the Americans will sell some to him, though the Americans are going to want to use all their production from this point on for themselves. Anyway, maybe you're going to do all of those things. But how that helps Ukraine or the people of Europe or the future of Europe, I simply cannot say. I've spoken about the failure of European diplomacy in many programs. I'm sorry to say that it continues. Even when the puppet master, the United States, is cutting the strings, the puppets continue to dance to the same old tune. It's an astonishing picture. Anyway, I'm going to finish by just doing a quick roundup of the military situation. Now, it seems to me that there's been a fair amount of news over the last couple of hours. The most important is that the Russians have captured a village northwest of the Oskol River called Kamenka. It is widely believed that this is a strategically important village northwest of the Oskol River. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have been saying so. It's taken the Russians some time to capture this village, which shows that the Ukrainians also attributed importance to it, but it is now captured. Anyway, there are lots of reports of Russian forces now gathering around the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. There's also reports of the Russians starting to send reconnaissance groups to probe villages just outside the town of Liman itself, and of the Russians also engaging in significant advances both east and west of Siversk. It looks as if a major blow in this area is coming, one perhaps intended to reverse the outcome of Ukraine's one actual success in this war, the Kharkiv 2022 counteroffensive, to recapture Liman, Kupiansk, Izium and Balakleya. The forces that have been assembled seem to be powerful enough for that kind of objective. But the Ukrainians themselves say that the most difficult situation for them is now in the area south of Konstantinovka, the southern town of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. And there are reports, there are now a cascade of reports, mostly from the Russians, but I believe some reports also from the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians are now in the process of retreating completely from the central part of Chasiv Yar, that that the Russians have now entered the two remaining micro-districts of Chasiv Yar. The Chasiv Yar could be completely cleared at some point within the next few days. That the Battle of Chasiv Yar, and by the way, the Battle of Bakhmut, because Chasiv Yar is in a sense a kind of satellite town of Bakhmut, that the Battle of Bakhmut is finally over. Battle which began back in November 2022. Bakhmut itself was captured by the Russians in May 2023 by the Wagner Group, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. Then there was intense fighting as the Ukrainians tried to recapture Bakhmut in the summer of 2023. Then the Russians pushed them back and cleared all of the villages to the west of Bakhmut over the course of 2024. Then in the early summer, they began their first assaults on Chasiv Yar itself. Eventually, over the course of 2024, they captured the micro-district to the east of the Seversky Donets aqueduct, which bisects Chasiv Yar. Then they crossed the aqueduct. Then there's been intense fighting for the rest of Chasiv Yar ever since. And it seems finally as if all of those battles are now finally coming to an end. And the entire Bakhmut area, Bakhmut, Solidar, the various villages around Bakhmut, Kurdyumovka, Klishayevka, all of these places, and of course Chasiv Yar itself, are finally coming under Russian control. With the Russians, once they control this entire territory, holding the high ground, and able to shell Konstantinovka and observe what goes on there, and not just Konstantinovka, but all of the surrounding area as well. And apparently the Russians have also been making further moves around Toretsk and the places nearby. There's even some talk of a potential operational crisis, a cauldron for the Ukrainians starting to develop in the territory between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and south of Konstantinovka. And the Russians gradually, well actually practically now, on the southern outskirts of Konstantinovka itself. I had assumed that the big blow was going to fall on the Dnieper, that the Russians were going to push to the Dnieper. But it looks as if these movements on the Oskol and Zherebets rivers and around Konstantinovka, they all suggest that it's the cities, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and further west, Pokrovsk. that for the moment are the Russian priority. And around Pokrovsk, there's more reports. The Russians appear to be edging closer now to the important village of Novoekonomichny, located just north of the main road, going east from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. And I discussed how the Russians seem to be taking Pokrovsk into a semicircle. And there's been rather ominous news, at least ominous from a Ukrainian point of view, because the Ukrainian authorities yesterday announced the evacuation of civilians from certain villages lying southwest of Pokrovsk in Dnipro region. It looks as if they expect the Russians to attack these villages fairly soon. That would mean the Russians crossing into Dnipro region. They've reached the area close to the border with Dnipro region, but they've not so far made any attempt to cross it. But seizing these villages apparently as part of some big battle which is coming to take Pokrovsk. And there has been other news from other battle places, but there's been a lot of talk, mostly over the last couple of days, about Russian units, maybe reconnaissance parties, most likely reconnaissance parties, in the area of Kherson region, crossing the Dnieper River, scouting on the west bank, the Ukrainian-controlled bank of the Dnieper River, west of Kherson city. The Russians have apparently captured all the islands in the Dnieper. I gather they did this some time ago. And again, there's lots of rumors and speculation about a Russian amphibious operation in western Kherson region, perhaps to try to recapture the town of Kherson itself. I think myself that this is perhaps too early to assume that that is indeed the Russian plan. But of course, if the Russians do cross the Dnieper, and especially if they do recapture Kherson, then the whole topic of recapturing Odessa will probably restart all over again. Well, there we are. An important week in the Ukraine conflict. We've had frenetic activity from the Trump administration for weeks now, and relative quiet over the last few days. I get the sense that the Americans have run out of steam, that they've now reached that point where they understand that negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians are the only way forward. And, well, everything now hangs on what Vladimir Zelensky, of all people, decides to do. Now, I'm going to finish briefly with two final observations. The first is one last point about Ukraine. Now, there's been an enormous narrative that has been circulated right across the media in the West, and which Donald Trump himself has occasionally indulged in, which claims that Vladimir Putin has been stringing Donald Trump along, that he talks peace with Trump but can never actually be pinned down. Whenever Trump makes a proposal, Putin somehow evades giving a concrete answer to it. A lot of people believe this narrative, but let me quickly say that it is, as far as I can see, complete nonsense. Putin set out his terms in June 2024 in his speech to the Foreign Ministry. He has never at any time shifted position from those terms. He's made that apparently clear to Donald Trump over the course of several conversations, Putin has repeatedly said that temporary ceasefires are not a good idea in Ukraine, be they for 30 days or longer, and that ceasefires in Ukraine are not a good idea either, because the Ukrainians merely use them to strengthen their position, and that is something that the Russians cannot afford to allow. I am unable to see how saying the same thing for a whole year amounts to stringing the other side along. If having a completely consistent position is stringing someone along, then I think the expression stringing someone along needs to be completely redefined, because it is nonsense. So let us not be taken in by this absurd talk. The initiative in starting this whole process has come from the Americans. The Russians have responded to proposals the Americans have made. They've done so while sticking to their own position. It is not stringing someone along to refuse to agree to proposals made to you by the other side. And remember, in this conflict, the United States is the other side, because it is they who have been arming Ukraine and providing it with intelligence, and who, as we know from that article in the New York Times, were effectively running the war. So, as I said, this narrative is wrong at every conceivable level, and we should ignore it. Now, the second thing I want to say is about the elections that have just taken place in Canada. I predict that Alex Christoforou and I will discuss them shortly in a future program. All I will say is that, as far as I can see, they have deepened the crisis in Canada. They have left in power a government that is well past its sell-by date, led by a technocrat who has none of the political skills that Canada needs at this particular time. And they've also created a situation in the Canadian Parliament which looks to me to be ripe for paralysis and division. I ought to say, if I'm critical of the Liberals, I won't pretend that from a distance I found the Conservatives in Canada, or their leader, Mr. Poilievre, to be at all impressive either. So this whole outcome of this election, it reminds me an awful lot of the election in Germany. It fails to address the underlying structural problems in the Canadian economy and in Canadian society. And again, I get the sense that various spectres have been waved around, in this case Donald Trump, in order to produce the outcome that we have. And I think that the outcome will be one which sadly Canada and the Canadian people will pay a heavy price for. Now, on that rather dark note, I'm going to end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you've liked this program, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.